Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and I want to unpack what you just saw with President Trump and his essential press conference at the NATO summit. He talked about many different things, so let's break down what has been taking place and what is the president referring to. Essentially, he had declared that the ceasefire with Iran is effectively dead, over, accusing Tehran of violating its commitments by attacking the commercial shipping. Now he said that the negotiations have become a waste of time. He said that they're crazy, a lot of different things he said. And you know what's interesting watching President Trump talk at that press conference is in the 2 terms he's been president of the United States and dealing on the international stage, many countries, many analysts, and many Americans called him crazy or cuckoo. And so it's the first time I'm watching the president call another nation or other people the same thing that he's been called all these past few years based on the things he's said, his decisions, and his politics. So here you have it. So he said it's a waste of time unless Iran changes course and, essentially accusing Iran of violating the agreement. And in that, he said the United States military remains on high alert. And then at the same time, you have Iran that has accused Washington of violating the ceasefire agreement and warned that the neighboring countries, when it comes to assisting the United States and their military operations, so we're talking about Saudi, Qatar, UAE, Oman, Bahrain, all of those other countries that have U.S. military base, while Iran is warning them against assisting the United States. Now, the question remains, do they really have a choice? They have a U.S. Base there, military base. How would that country have a choice after they've allowed a military base in their country? So that remains, a position where how can you ask them not to assist? When the agreement is that the United States has military bases in those countries. And so now you have Iranian officials that have also claimed to have targeted U.S. military facilities in the Gulf and shot down the American drone. An Iranian official says that Trump's comments drive the regions towards fire. Those are very extreme terms. And that warns that Iranian proxies in the region have their fingers on the triggers. Those are quotes from Iran state media. And in response, Iran said that it was targeting U.S. military sites in Bahrain and Kuwait. The U.S. strikes that followed yesterday were because of the attacks in Strait of Hormuz, but now that's escalated much more. Oil prices have now gone to the $80 per barrel because of this tension, and the markets have reacted very immediately. Now, Tehran is warning its neighbors, but it is continuing to escalate and claims that the attacks on U.S. facilities are Iranian. And Iran officials have also reported shooting down the drone, and they're going to escalate on some other areas as well. Now, this creates the crisis in the area of the commercial vessels that have previously, at the height of the escalation, left thousands of seafarers stranded. And now this renewed concern about security of this incredibly critical passageway and what we're seeing with the latest violence that has erupted is now, of course, driving oil prices high. You can rest assured insurance companies are not going to insure the vessels that have to go through that passageway, and all parties that signed the MOU have now gone against the MOU. Now, we're looking at currently with the escalation that's taking place, there's about 6,000 seafarers that have been affected in the Strait of Hormuz, and that's what's taking place right now. Now, President Trump says the U.S., and he said the U.S. will probably strike Iran again. And this is something that he's saying about Iran. And you saw in the video that we just played for you that, Iran, he accused Tehran of lying, cheating, and violating the deal. And he said he's going to hit Iran very hard overnight. So this is something that we're going to cover as this would create a massive escalation and would erupt the war again. It wasn't like what we saw, a week ago where there were some fires exchanged and then they called a truce to get back to the table to continue their talks. This looks like if this continues, it would mean something greater than what we've seen prior to April 7th, when the initial ceasefire began. Now, a senior Iranian officials warned that President Trump's declaration that this ceasefire is over could push the Middle East towards fire, is what we're seeing take place, and we've covered that in detail. And that is the Iranian advisor Ali Akbar Velayati, who said that Iran will have immediate response. And this comes at a time where also Iran is saying that this cancels the ceasefire. So what it appears that President Trump and Iran are on the same page about the ceasefire being over. And so this is very critical time, as we're going to bring you the latest development on any escalation that takes place in the region and how this is going to impact not just the oil prices, but what it's going to mean in terms of the region overall. And especially now that, all news media is focused on what is taking place at the NATO summit and all of the announcements that have been made about the NATO summit. We're going to bring you that into detail right now. What I do want to cover is that this also, President Trump did say that he's going to reimpose naval blockade on Iran, that could happen. And what that would mean is essentially put the naval blockade against the Iranian ports that would prevent it from trading, which in a way, I think it did bring Iran to the table for the MOU as well. Trump did mention Karg Island as a major Iranian oil terminal that could be part of the blockade potentially. We know that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that future strikes could go deeper than what we've seen previously. And we also heard news that Pete Hegseth was just Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense, was on his way to Israel, but he had to reroute and go back to Washington, D.C. So could that mean that he's also preparing for the escalation of war? All signs seem to be targeting that way. And you also have Bahrain, Kuwait that have also reported Iranian attacks after the U.S. strikes. Bahrain's military says that the intercepted Iranian missiles and drone attacks overnight as the escalation point, accusing Tehran of targeting civilians. Kuwait also said that it had been targeted and has reported that this escalation is taking place with the Gulf countries again. So this is very critical of who's going to come to the table. And what's interesting now is that the UAE is not being attacked. There was some indication that the UAE and Iran had talks, which is showing now, because of their talks and to what sort of agreement they've come to, is the reason why UAE is not in the attacks way. So does this mean that the other countries that are currently being attacked, like Bahrain and Kuwait, are going to come to table and talk with Iran directly? Previously, it was all going through back channels and through the United States, and now it appears that these countries have woken up and realized that they have to be talking to each other and figure out how to deal with one another as neighboring countries whose GDP, whose revenues, whose oil exports are going to be at risk if they're not talking to each other, as President Trump is unpredictable with what he does. And we know that Israeli Prime Minister has his own mission of what he wants to accomplish in the region. So you have some of those competing factors taking place. So those are some of the concerns. Now, going on to what President Trump said about Spain, we're going to go into that in a lot more detail. And but what I do want to do is cover what President Trump has done so far being at the NATO summit. So you have President Trump that's met with Syria's president Ahmed al-Sharaa during the NATO summit. And this is while discussing Iran and regional security. If you recall, just a few weeks ago, he said that, it should be Syria that should take care of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that Israel should back down. So this was of note to see the two presidents talking to one another, because President Trump had suggested Syria could play a role in reducing Hezbollah's power in Lebanon. And this is very critical because you had President Trump meet with the Syrian president and say that al-Sharaa was a tough leader, right? And we know that because he was also the head in Al-Qaeda. So this is also a massive situation there. Syria is seeking international integration at this time, and it did a massive deal with Lebanon to be able to have talks again. So this is going to be very interesting to see, is now the Syrian president going to agree with President Trump in terms of their role of what they could do with Hezbollah? And we know that the Iranian proxies and Hezbollah being an Iranian proxy, it's going to only escalate given the latest tensions with the United States. Now you have President Trump discussing with the Syrian president about Iran, Hezbollah, and Lebanon. And this meeting comes at this critical time with the Middle East escalation that's taking place. Now, this is a major diplomatic signal because Washington is appearing and willing to engage with Syria's new leadership while using Damascus as a part of what would be a broader strategy against Iranian-backed groups like Hezbollah. And at the same time, President Trump also praised Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, saying that Israel may withdraw from Lebanon during these talks. This is what he said, is that he said that the Israeli Prime Minister is a great wartime prime minister, and said that he expects Israel will withdraw on the ground troops from Lebanon. The ground troops, the escalation in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, started early March, essentially after the war started on February 28th with Israeli and U.S. strikes in Iran, killing Ayatollah Khamenei. Well, then you had Hezbollah attack Israel, and then Israel decided that they're going to go ground invasion in Lebanon. And essentially, right now, in the past few months, they've occupied about 14% of Lebanon's land. Escalation continues between Hezbollah as well as the IDF Israeli forces in southern Lebanon, even though you have Lebanon and Syria talk after a very long time, and also Syria and Israel have talks, yet it hasn't done anything so far on the ground. Part of the MOU was that it was supposed to have the Israeli soldiers withdraw from Lebanon's land and give them back southern Lebanon. And so this is something that President Trump is now talking about, saying that, that Israel said that they might do so. Now, we know that Israeli Prime Minister said he has no intention, that they're a sovereign country, they have their own mission, and what the U.S. signs, it does not apply to them. We've heard that from Ben-Gvir, also minister in the Israeli government, but yet we have the Prime Minister of Israel doing rounds on U.S. media yesterday and the day before, and saying that, yes, there's been some discussions with the president, but overall they share the same goals, the same perceptions. And so it's noteworthy that now President Trump, after 2 weeks ago, saying not such nice things about the Israeli Prime Minister at NATO, has taken the opportunity to say that, the Israeli Prime Minister is a wartime leadership. He has wartime leadership. Well, a lot of the wars he's involved in. And he also has an election at the end of the year. And then he also said that Israel's getting along with Lebanon. I The facts don't show that to be the case. And President Trump said that he expects Israeli ground troops to withdraw. Again, facts don't show that to be the case so far. And the U.S.-Israel tensions seem like, when they were at the height over Iran and Lebanon, it seems like it's appearing to soften between the two, because we're not hearing any criticism from President Trump to the Israeli Prime Minister. Now we're seeing a tone that is different. And you also saw Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, also saying, talking about Israel. He mentioned Israel probably 2, 3 times in just less than a minute, about the actions taken in Iran, and overall about how Iran should not become a nuclear nation. Now, here's the bigger situation. Now, Iran is saying that even though it wasn't going to have nuclear program and nuclear arms, that now it's saying that this should have the posture like other countries to have nuclear weapons, so they won't be attacked like this year and last year. So now have things been more escalated to now push Iran to go towards nuclear program? Now, there's no indication of them doing so, but now the greater argument is what does this mean for the future of the region and what Iran may do? Now that you've seen millions of people, we showed you the images of Ayatollah Khamenei's funeral procession through Iran, through Iraq and Iran, on the way to Mashhad, where he's going to be married, a city in Iran, which is a holy city. And so you're seeing millions of outpouring of support on the streets. This is probably one of the biggest funeral processions in the world's history. When the Queen died, we didn't see this. When the Pope passed, we didn't see this. So, at a time where you're seeing the Iranian regime get a boost in what appears to be their own public support, and here's the thing, those mourners on the street, and if we can please pull up images, because we showed that a few days ago, and the procession still continues. So please show some of the images if you can while I describe what we're going to look at, is the reality is you have the mourners on the streets. And even though, let's just say, they don't support the regime, all of them, because we saw those mass eruptions of protest take place, what we know definitely is that they do not support President Trump or the Israeli Prime Minister. And like end to end of the street, from eye to eye, you can see that level of support. And then there was videos, and if you get a chance, watch them. They're chanting, and then there's also chants to Death to America. There's slogans, Death to America. And this is what President Trump was referring to, that he's on every list. And so you could see this level of support that's now being shown for the Ayatollah, the late Ayatollah. And so this is a very critical time of what does it mean for the future of Iran? What does it stand? If anything, this regime looks more empowered and more support than what you're seeing. And why do I say that? Well, because they're mourning the late Ayatollah. The Ayatollah was the regime. He was the head of the regime. He's the supreme leader. So if you're going to mourn the supreme leader, all indications show that you're supporting the regime. And so this is a very critical thing. And the narrative on changing the regime or doing a coup or any of those things, those are long forgotten. Like they're such old news compared to those images of what you're seeing, with what appears to be a wartime united Iran behind their supreme leader, their new supreme leader, who's the son of the late Ali Khamenei, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, now with the current supreme leader, who is his son, Ayatollah Moshtaba Khamenei. Now, here is the interesting fact that when Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was alive, he did not agree to his son, Moshtaba Khamenei, to become the next supreme leader because he said that this is not a monarchy where your firstborn takes the rule. He's like, this is an Islamic cleric state, and we have clerics who will decide on who is the next best person to become the supreme leader. So, given that the escalations and the conflict that erupted from February 28th, it created a vacuum. And then you had the support for Moshtaba Khamenei, whose father, the late Ayatollah, wouldn't have chosen to be the new leader. So there's a lot of stance and positioning and messaging that you're seeing from Iran. And just look at those images in all of history. This is the biggest funeral procession to date. I don't know if we'll see another one this big again, but here is what you're seeing. And I want to remind you, this is July. This is the Middle East. It is almost 40 degrees Celsius. It is very hot. We're talking about a heat wave in Europe and in North America. You can imagine the heat wave of what's in the Middle East, more specifically in Tehran, where it's surrounded by mountains. So there's a boiling point at the base. And so you have that level of outpouring of support. And so this is very critical to be mindful of. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back and we'll cover what's happening at the NATO summit in quite detail.